Well, with Jeremiah chapter 10, we're going to actually get into a little bit of Old Testament poetry today. There's some of the chapters in Jeremiah are more poetic, some are more prose, but it's really interesting, just to see them go back and forth on this. So today's going to be a little bit more poetry about the problems with idol worship, basically, with idolatry and things like that. So it's going to be really interesting, some of the little nuggets, little things we get to pick up in today's chapter. So starting with in fact, before I start with verse 1, I want to read you something that Thompson put in his book of Jeremiah that tries to encapsulate this chapter, basically. He says, "This poem is a scathing and satirical attack on idols. Because of striking similarities to Isaiah 40, 41, 44, and 46, it has sometimes been regarded as a post-exilic addition to the book of Jeremiah." What that means basically is they think because it relies on a lot of Isaiah, it says a lot of things that would make more sense after when the Jews come back from the exile, that they think it was a poem written then and then inserted into the book of Jeremiah. That is a possibility that is what is the case. I think it's equally possible that we're getting some information more from like a heavenly message rather than Jeremiah's interpretation. So just like in Isaiah, we have the idea of some of Isaiah may not have been written by him, but that's also taking the perspective of ruling out divine revelation. If you believe in revelation and that God can speak to man and God can teach men things that men don't even understand all the way, can help men beyond their bounds, then things like this can be very possible from Jeremiah himself, just like the book of Isaiah was. So it says here, the text of the passage presents a number of problems. The Hebrew differs from the Septuagint in a number of places. Verse 12 through 16 occur again in chapters 51, 15 through 19. Verse 11 is in Aramaic. As a result of textual problems, commentators have been ready to rearrange the verses into what appears to them to be a more logical and consistent pattern. Such arrangements are always open to question. Ancient Hebrew logic was not always the same as that of our time, and while there may be some virtue in rearranging the material for the purpose of explaining the passage for a modern audience, we are in danger of destroying an ancient pattern which has its own peculiar emphasis. In view of the great variety of attempts to rearrange Jeremiah 10, 1 through 16, it may be wise to ask whether such attempts are really the right procedure. So this is kind of I want to give you insight into the scholarly ideas of what's going on with Jeremiah 10. So scholars look at this and go, okay, this seems kind of a hodgepodge of a couple things here. So we may have a couple different manuscripts that have been used over the centuries to create the scriptures we have today. And so there's some challenges and problems with this. And so we're going to kind of set it aside and chop it up and try to find a logical way to think about this. And what Thompson's saying is maybe there's another option out there. So he says, continuing on, apart from the unusual Aramaic insertion in verse 11, it is possible to discern a reasonable pattern in which alternating assertions are made about the idols and Yahweh. After an introductory segment, which is verse 1, we have a warning against idols, the supremacy of Yahweh, the futility of idols, the reality and creative power of Yahweh, the idols and their makers to be judged, and final judgment, acknowledgement of Yahweh's supremacy. So you can kind of see as we go through this chapter today, there's the back and forth between idols and Yahweh. There's a comparison that's going on, and we see this a little bit as a pattern even in the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah was comparing, hey, you can go this path away from God or this path toward God. Basically, there was a lot of comparisons in Isaiah. So this chapter is following in a similar genre, basically. Let's see. Seen in this way, the whole passage has coherence and order. It is not unthinkable that the passage may have had a parallel in some liturgical form which was used in the temple, in which a contrast was drawn between Israel's true God, Yahweh, and the worthless idols to which some in Israel showed overdue respect. That there are parallels in thought and even in wording with some passages in Psalms and in Isaiah may indicate no more than that there was a traditional language of worship in Israel which was in use for a long period of time. But whether or not this passage represents some liturgical form in which he was familiar, there is much in the poem which is in the spirit of Jeremiah, and one wonders just how valid is the complete rejection of Jeremiah authorship made by some writers. So some scholars look at this and go, Jeremiah didn't write this book. This is a compilation of a bunch of other stuff come together just because we can find it in other places. That's just one way to look at it, okay? One thing that's important to think of when you look at scholarship, especially biblical scholarship, but truthfully any scholarship, is realize these are the opinions of people. That's all they are. They might be really super smart and pretty good at their opinion, but they're opinions. What we need to be doing is making sure we're taking the time to seek truth. And the single absolute best way for us to seek truth is to pray and ask God to guide us with His Spirit. If we know it from God, if we gain a testimony of it through His Spirit, we will know the truth. That is the thing we should always be focused on, regardless of where we learn truth. You can study Islam, you can study Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism and Protestantism and Catholicism and atheism and all this stuff. You could study these different isms and you can learn truth. The key is using the Spirit to find the nuggets of truth and dispelling the stuff that you don't necessarily need. It's more opinion. But it takes a real understanding of the Spirit of God to do that. So that's another way to think about what we're learning here, basically. So let's jump in and get started with this, where there's some fun play we're going to see in this between comparing idols and worshiping God, basically. So some really good principles that even in our day and age, even though we don't have wooden idols and stone idols and things that we pray to today, anything we put more important than God can be seen as an idol to us. That's the thing we have to look at. So it might not be as literal as in the Old Testament, but we can still metaphorically have idols in our life, things we worship more than God. And we're still running into those same problems, basically. So watch out for those things in your life. So verse 1, hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. So this, just starting off, is a message from God. So we could say this is revelation. This is beautiful. I love this because this shows Jeremiah got revelation. 100 years before him, Isaiah got revelation. Centuries before him, other people got revelation. Centuries before them, other people got revelation. Moses got revelation. Abraham got revelation, all the way back. The beauty is this is showing a pattern that God is continuously revealing things to His people who are willing to follow His commandments. Continuing revelation is a thing, and it's easily proven out in the Bible just by noticing there's no stop in revelation. It just keeps going, which is awesome. So long as the people are willing to follow God, He will bless them with a prophet and He will work with them. We see this all the time. So, okay, verse 2, thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. Bam, right out of the gate. Really succinct phrase that God has put there. Do not worry about learning the heathen's way of doing things. Don't think about, I need to, let's go learn what this other people are doing. Focus on learning what God wants you to learn. Now that doesn't mean, I shouldn't study Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or other things like that at all. It means to learn the gospel, you don't need to. I mean, if you have the gospel, it's there. Just keep learning it. You can still learn the truths that these other ideas have and bring them into what you know is truth as well. But focus on studying the gospel, basically. Now, what's interesting is another way to translate this can be, do not be disciples of the religion of the nations. So not so much don't learn about everybody else, but don't be a disciple of theirs. Don't join their club and drink their Kool-Aid. That could be another way to phrase it, basically. One significant aspect of ancient Near Eastern religions was their attention to astral deities, sun, moon, and stars. This practice was a concern of Amos a century earlier than Jeremiah. We're still going to learn about him in the Lesser Prophets section coming up. In Manasseh's day, this is the king of Judah, he was 687, 642 BC, the practice was rife and was one of the targets of Josiah's reform. The nations held celestial phenomena in awe, particularly abnormal phenomena like comets and eclipses. Such awe was improper in Israel since it was the true God, the living God, the everlasting King who controlled these heavenly phenomena. That's Thompson from his book of Jeremiah as well. So this is really fascinating to think about. Okay, should you worship the sun, the moon, and the stars, and astrological things that are happening, or should you focus on the God that created the sun and the moon and stars? I mean, it's funny how that just sounds like a common sense question, but it's a good question to ask. Now, verse 3, for the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. This is I like this story we're going to get into here about. This is an idea of how an idol is made, basically. So this is really fascinating. So they deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be borne because they cannot go, meaning someone's got to carry them because they can't move on their own. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither also is it in them to do good. Now I love the irony that God is presenting in this. I mean, think about it. This is something that was a tree that grew for decades and decades and decades in the forest. Then somebody comes, cuts it down, takes it back into the city, shaves it off, breaks it down to smaller pieces, carves out this figurine in it. Then they attach it to the wall so that it stays up, or they attach it to a platform to help keep it level and keep it standing upright. And yet they think that this idol will actually control the elements, like storm deities, Baal, the storm deity, Marduk, Molech, all these people. It's so funny that they can't move on their own. Somebody has to pick it up and carry it. What kind of God needs to be carried by a human? Now, this could be a whole other story if suddenly a tree fell over and it all stripped off, the bark suddenly fell off of it and it got chopped on its own into little pieces, and miraculously this idol like gets carved out on its own out of a tree. That could be something else, like, holy cow, no one made it, it just made itself. That could be something. But these idols are built by a human. Is it a God if a human creates it? That's the challenge here, basically. So idols don't speak, they don't move, they can't do anything on their own. So God's like, look, they can't do anything. Don't worry about them. Don't freak out. Don't worry. Don't lose sleep over what an idol can and can't do, because they do nothing. Basically, this is, in a way, idol worship in the Old Testament is the ultimate placebo effect. They believe it, and so they think it's real. It's so crazy how this concept can be there, basically. So let's see, verse 6, for as much as there is none like unto thee, O Lord. So now we're flipping over to compare worshiping God. Thou art great, and thy name is great in might. So the real God is very different from the idols, is what they're saying here. There is none like unto thee, meaning none of these idols match what God can do. Now here's the thing that's interesting is God never gives the people an image of himself to worship. Doesn't do that. They get mad. In fact, they get in trouble for it in Moses' day with the golden calf. Not that they worshiped the golden calf, but they worshiped through the golden calf to God. And God's like, nope, you don't need that. I want you to build a relationship with me. He doesn't give idols at all. I mean, Jesus Christ himself is probably the closest to Christianity would come to that. And it's because we want to build a relationship with him directly, not something that's intercessory, basically. In fact, another way to see this when he says, thy name is great in might, Whereas idols derive their status and authority solely from human sources, Yahweh derives his position and authority from himself alone. He stands unique. This is something that's interesting, that this principle in verse 6. Thy name is great in might. He is God, whether a human exists or not. Idols don't become gods without a human. But God is God without humans. It doesn't matter whether human's alive or not. God is still God. He doesn't derive his power from the people. He has an intrinsic power, basically. So a really good comparison, really good idea to think about. So verse 7, who would not fear thee, O King of nations? For to thee doth it appertain. For as much as among all the wise men of the nations, and in all their kingdoms, there is none like unto thee. Short and sweet, pretty simple, basically. God is God, and he is greater than all of us. He's created the world. He created the trees. He created the earth and the sun and the moon and the atmosphere and everything so the trees could grow that are then cut down and chopped into idols. He is greater than everything. Why should we not worship him and work with him? Now verse 8, we're going to switch back to the idols, basically. It says, but they are altogether brutish and foolish. The stock is a doctrine of vanities. Short and sweet, don't worry about the idols. This philosophy that you can carve a god and it will suddenly control nature is absurd. Absolutely absurd is what they're saying. Verse 9, silver spread into plates is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz, the work of the workman and the hands of the founder. Blue and purple is their clothing. They are all the work of cunning men. That's all an idol is false. It's a bunch of humans who have made stuff and combined it together, and that's it. There's no intrinsic value in it, basically. That's it. So that's an important thing to always look at. The idol, now here's something that's really interesting. The idol is only wood overlaid with gold and silver and decked out with fine garments. The gold and silver may have come from distant lands like Tarshish and Ophir, but this does not change the fact of the case. The idol remains a lifeless, speechless production of human hands. Tarshish was probably the western limit of the ancient world, perhaps Tartessus in Spain, which exported silver, lead, iron, and tin to Tyre. The situation of Ophir is unknown. Uphaz in the Masoretic reading is also unknown. And although some commentators have identified it with Ophir, there is no evidence for this. There is another possibility that it may be that we do not have place references here at all, but rather a reference to the metallurgical processes by which silver and gold were prepared. The noun Tarsus has recently been translated refinery, so that silver from Tarsus may mean refined silver. If this is correct, the next phrase may well mean gold, even fine gold. Thus, the description of the idol is that it is only wood, refined silver, and fine gold, the work of a craftsman coming from the hands of the goldsmith. The violet and purple garments are likewise the work of human craftsmen. Despite all its finery, the idol remains an idol. That's what Thompson was saying in his book. So they're just there. They're just inanimate objects. Why are we putting effort and time into this? It's hollow. It can't help you. So if you think about this, anything that you worship more than God, anything that you spend more time with than God, if it came down to, do we go worship God or do we go do this thing? If it goes like this, that thing is the idol in your life, basically. You could see these same analogies working that way. And it's like, but God, this is maybe fun and exciting and neat and looks good, but this is real. Maybe we should put some emphasis here too. Now verse 10, so we're switching back. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and an everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shall tremble, and the nations shall not be able to abide his indignation. So you can't argue with that. Pretty straightforward. God is God. Verse 11, thus shall ye say to them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens. He hath made the earth by his power, he hath established the world by his wisdom, and hath stretched out the heavens by his discretion. So again, we're comparing God as the creator and these idols who were created, basically. So good, I like the contrast here. Presumably, now verse 11 we've talked about in the very beginning, if you remember. Verse 11 was written in Aramaic. So here's something to think about. Presumably, this Aramaic verse, verse 11, which interrupts the flow of verses 10, 12, and 13, represents a scribal comment. It is not impossible that it was a well-known saying. That it is in Aramaic is no necessary argument for a late date, since Aramaic was widely known in Western Asia and among people on Israel's borders. Even so, it may represent a marginal note added later by an Aramaic speaker. The thought is in any case not inconsistent with Jeremiah's outlook. So this is, remember verse 11, thus shall ye say unto them. So this is making a statement here, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish. And then verse 12 is, he hath made earth by his power. So if you think of verse 10, the Lord is a true God, he is living God, he is the king. And then verse 12 would be, he hath made the earth by his power, he hath established the world by his wisdom. So we don't need 11, verse 11 in there. If you think about it, 10 flows right into 12 really smoothly. But what they're saying is that verse 11 has probably been added, not by necessarily Jeremiah, but it might be a later scribe that inserted that in, because most of this chapter is Hebrew, but this was Aramaic, basically. Now, it's plausible that it was there at the time of Jeremiah's life, and so it got put in around his time frame. But it's equally plausible that this was a later, verse 11 was a later addition to here. So this kind of strikes at the idea of the Bible being perfect. There's actually scriptural inserts that have been made by scribes over the years. Some scholars can go back and go, yeah, we see it. No, we don't see this anymore. And back some stories, some ideas that we have today don't date that far back. They were something that were created or added into the Bible in the 5th, 6th centuries instead of the 1st century. So this does happen sometimes. There are scribal commentary that's gotten inserted into here as if it's scripture. So you have to be careful when you think of the Bible as it's all perfect, because we can't prove that. And the Bible itself doesn't even say it's perfect. It's really, really something you got to think about. Let's go to verse 13 now. When he uttereth his voice, so we're still talking about God, there is a multitude of waters in the heavens, and he causeth the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He maketh lightnings with rain, and bringeth forth the wind out of his treasures. I like verse 13. There's a couple of great reasons here. When they're talking at the beginning, when he uttereth his voice, there's a multitude of waters in the heavens. It has been used in other parts of the scriptures that when God speaks, it sounds like raging water. Like it's a booming, loud sound. Even Joseph Smith made some comments about how amazing it was to be in that presence and to hear those things. But there's other scriptures, other prophets through the scriptures have made a similar comment. But also, it's important that he's talking about, he causeth the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He maketh lightnings rain. This is storm deity ideas. So God is the controller of the storms, not Baal. Baal is the Canaanite storm deity, but it's really God that's doing it, not Baal. So they're giving a comparison with that directly. And he bringeth forth the wind out of his treasures. Now, this is an important point for us to look at, okay? If you look at the Hebrew version interpretation of the word treasures, it is storehouses. In some of the apocryphal writings, so the non-scriptural parts of the scriptures, there are stories of this concept that in a modern way, we could look at it this way. God has a series of warehouses, basically, in heaven. Each warehouse is where he stores the elements that we would call the laws of physics today. So like water, he has a storehouse of water. There's a treasury, is what they're called in the scriptures, where this emanates from. And it emanates from him, from heaven, into our world, basically. If you're thinking from three-dimensional standpoint, coming from like maybe outer space into the earth is where a three-dimensional perspective of this. You kind of have to think a little more four-dimensional on this and understand that dimensions themselves can make a difference. If you think of the concepts of quantum mechanics and different energy levels, heaven could be just a different energy level than us. And so the laws of physics that we know today are being controlled by principles and ideas that are in heaven, but their effect is being allowed into, from that dimension into our dimension, and influencing how everything runs here. There is a lot of talk in the quantum mechanical world about gravitons, the subatomic particle that allows gravity to work, can exist in another dimension and then are being controlled and sent interdimensionally to us to impact our world. Thus, if we could control gravitons, we could send a message back to that other dimension, and they could send a message to us, kind of an idea. If you watch Ant-Man, and this idea of the quantum realm and things, that's kind of what they're talking about. Thompson had this comment that I thought was really appropriate to go along with verse 13. He said, "The Hebrew text seems to have suffered in transmission. Clearly, though, a storm is depicted. Thunder, his voice, lightning, rain, and wind all follow the divine movement in the skies. There are interesting insights into the meteorology of Jeremiah's day in this verse. God brings up clouds from the distant horizons. He sets the waters of the heavens in a tumult. He makes flashes of lightning to accompany the rain and releases the winds from his storehouse. These are not mere natural phenomena, nor are they the work of deities like Bel or Hadad. It is all the work of Yahweh." So again, that idea of it's the real God that's doing this, not the idols that are really controlling the elements, even though a lot of people back then thought it was the idols. Nope, there's actually a real God controlling it all. Verse 14, "Every man is brutish in his knowledge. Every founder is confounded by the graven image. For his molten image is falsehood, and there is no breath in them." So this is kind of talking about the idea, again, we're now back on the idols side with verse 14, how every man is brutish in his knowledge, meaning basically that people, well, the easiest way is God's ways are higher than our ways. He thinks differently than we do. From his perspective, our thinking is very rudimentary, very fundamental, whereas he has a much more expansive way of thinking. He wants us to get to that point and learn more, but it takes a lot of time for us to get there. But again, he's saying, look, these guys, don't worship these idols. They're fake. They're false. In fact, verse 15, he says, "They are vanity. They are the work of errors. In the time of their visitation, they shall perish." Now, visitation can also be reckoning, which is like a day of judgment. When it comes down to it, when the storm hits, you pray to your idol and nothing happens, you'll know your idol didn't do anything, because it can't do anything. It's just a piece of wood or metal. Verse 16, continuing on here, "The portion of Jacob is not like them." Now here's a good comparison. Portion of Jacob is not like them, meaning the idols. "For he is the former of all things, and Israel is the rod of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name." Now, what is the portion of Jacob? Let's look at this. A similar phrase occurs in many of the Psalms. There's Psalms 16, 73, 119, as well as elsewhere in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 32, Lamentations 3. A man's portion referred to some possession that belonged to him, like an area of land. A share in some gift, a booty shared after battle, a share in the spirit of another. In the present context, Yahweh, the maker of all things, is declared to be the one who had chosen Israel as the tribe of his inheritance. That is his very own tribe. The correlate of this wonderful fact was that Yahweh was the portion of Jacob, that is, of Israel. Israel and Yahweh were bound together in a deep and intimate personal relationship in which Yahweh would extend unfailing love, care, and protection to Israel, and in which Israel might offer her gratitude, obedience, and love. In such a relationship, Israel had no cause to fear any other God, and certainly had no right to offer her worship to another God. So when you think about this idea of the portion of Jacob, think about covenants, specifically the marriage covenant in Isaiah. That's what the portion of Jacob is. Jacob was a righteous man. He wrestled with an angel. Remember that idea, wrestled with God. He gained the opportunity to be an important part of God's plan. His descendants are Israel. They are promised through Jacob, basically, to be the chosen people of Israel. Granted, that's still based on them following the commandments of God. So they have to follow the commandments of God. God will bless and take care of them. A covenant, a coming together, relationship. That's what the portion of Jacob is. God and that inheritance in working with God is the portion of Jacob. That inheritance. God wants us to inherit what he has, to live with him, to be with him. That's the portion of Jacob. That's what the covenants are all about. Returning to live with God again, and God allowing us to have what he has also. That's what it means. So verse 17, gather up thy wares out of the land, O inhabitant of the fortress. So this is get ready to flee, basically. For thus saith the Lord, behold, I will sling out the inhabitants of the land at this once, and I will distress them that they may find it so. Boy, was that strong word. So there's no waiting, no mercy. It's done. Get ready to flee because the onslaught is about to hit. Verse 19, woe is me for my hurt. My wound is grievous, but I said, truly, this is a grief, and I must bear it. So we could look at verse 19 and thinking of Jeremiah is now giving us his thoughts and ideas on what he just received from God, basically. Verse 19, my tabernacle is spoiled, all my cords are broken. Now this is really God in verse 20. And really, verse 19, we could see God in there as well, not just Jeremiah going, whoa, this is a big thing I got to deal with. But realizing that in verse 19, we could see God in there as the bridegroom. If you think of that marriage covenant idea, saying, my bride has left me. I am hurt. I am distraught because the woman I love has left me. That's kind of this idea we can this picture to paint in our minds, basically. So again, verse 20, my tabernacle is spoiled, all my cords are broken, my children are gone forth of me, and they are not. There is none to stretch forth my tent any more, and to set up my curtains. Now there's something important we have to understand about verse 20, okay? If you remember in Jeremiah, there's this idea of stakes and tents. And Jeremiah, in the Revelations Jeremiah got on this, the people were told to enlarge thy stakes, enlarge the tent, grow the size of the building so that we can include more people into it. But in verse 20, we have a bit of an update on this. And when he says, my tabernacle is spoiled, that's the temple. There is none to stretch forth my tent anymore, and to set up my curtains. Nobody is growing the church. It's withering and dying. It's going away because they're not reaching out and talking with people, basically. It's not being used properly, and so the tent's falling apart, basically. They've gone to other gods, other tents, if you will. So verse 21, for the pastors are become brutish and have not sought the Lord. Therefore they shall not prosper, and all their flocks shall be scattered. Verse 21 is a good leadership principle, okay? The spiritual leaders have left the people. The pastors are gone. They're not searching, they're not looking for God. They're not teaching God. They're doing their own thing. They're trying to build themselves up. come worship God through me because I am great, or things like that. They're using their position to gain more favor with men, not with God, basically. And so the pastors, here's the thing, the pastors are, it's interesting because they call the people following the pastor the flock, which makes the pastor the shepherd. The pastor or the religious leader should be a representation of the good shepherd, the true shepherd, which is Jesus Christ. And because we are the flock of Christ, the religious leaders are the hirelings, the hired people coming to help. Some help, some don't when times get tough. Some flee from the wolves rather than die, whereas the true shepherd would give his life for his sheep. That's Christ. Religious leaders are important to help us in our life, but our relationship with Christ is more important, and we should be focusing on that more. With the ordinances, our religious leaders should guide us to that. That's the key, really. But this is interesting because the flocks will be scattered. So the pastors are not paying attention. They're not trying to keep the people together, and so they're all going to go away and get scattered, basically. The religious leaders are not doing their part. They're doing what aggrandizes them, what helps them to have more wealth and power and influence, but they're not helping the people to come to God. That's all they should be doing. If they do that, God will bless them and take care of them. If they don't do that, they're on their own, basically. Now, verse 22, behold, the noise of the bruit is come, and a great commotion out of the north country, to make the cities of Judah desolate and a den of dragons. Now realize anytime you see the word dragons in the Old Testament, it's jackals, basically. So these are wild animals, not dragons, literally. Okay. Now verse 22 is prophecy of the armies of Babylon coming from the north to take out Judah, Jerusalem in the area, basically. So as it turned out, following Nebuchadnezzar's second invasion in 587 BC, destruction was widespread. Modern archaeological investigation has shown a uniform picture. Many towns were destroyed at the beginning of the 6th century BC and never again occupied. Others were destroyed at the times and partially reoccupied at some later date. Still, others were destroyed and reoccupied only after a long period of abandonment. There is no known case of a town in Judah proper which was continually occupied through the exilic period. The particular phrases used in the latter part of this verse seem to have been part of the literary language and used to describe the destruction of cities. So that's what Thompson was saying in his book. They've got destruction coming, and that was bad. The word desolate gets used a lot. We're going to see that a lot in Jeremiah's writings because of how thorough everything was destroyed. It was a crazy time. In fact, verse 23, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. O Lord, correct me, but with judgment. So you can think of Jeremiah praying after this revelation. Not in thine anger, lest thou bring me to nothing. So that's really an interesting idea. So this idea of what Jeremiah is saying is, I know that the way of man is not in himself. So we have agency to choose our destinies, but God has control of everything around us, and so he can guide us and help us. He doesn't overrun our agency. He gives us our agency, abilities to choose. That's why there's a heaven and a hell. If it was up to God, there would only be heaven. But some people will choose not to follow God, so there's a hell, basically. But here's the beauty. You could look at verse 23 and 24 from an existential basis and see this concept of, free will is an imaginary thing. We really don't have choice. It's all predetermined as to what's going on and what's happening. That's not what Jeremiah is getting at here. What he's saying is basically, we can't fix our own problems. We can get into the problem, but we can't get out of it on our own. We need God's help. to overcome the challenges, especially of sin. We can't get out of that one ourselves. That's where the atonement of Christ comes in, is to help us to overcome the challenges of our life. That's what he's really getting at here. So verse 25, pour out thy fury upon the heathen that know thee not, and upon the families that call not on thy name, for they have eaten up Jacob, and devoured him, and consumed him, and have made his habitation desolate. So this could be seen as Jeremiah saying, hey, punish those who are punishing us. They're not worshiping you just as much as we are not worshiping you. So that's looking for justice and equality, for everybody, basically, in that. And maybe that's kind of the logic that Jeremiah was having at that time, basically, of, well, if Judah's not following you, but all these other heathen nations are not following you either, shouldn't they be punished too? Kind of an idea. So that's one way we could look at that ending part of chapter 10. I hope you've enjoyed this video, going through and learning more about these. Like the videos. If you do, that helps us to get the algorithms working more to help promote our videos. Love your comments and feedback, what you think about what you've learned in this chapter, and we'll see you in the next one.